Thank all of you for coming. I guess some of you have to come. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Sandra Whitehouse. Sandra is a senior policy advisor for the Ocean Conservancy. She currently focuses on coastal marine and spatial planning issues as well as ocean acidification. She's been a long-time environmental advocate and policy advisor who uses her expertise as a marine science major to help shape environmental initiatives both in the state of Rhode Island, where she lives, at least part-time, and also with the federal government. She's currently a member of the advisory board for the Consortium of Ocean Leadership. She's on the University of Rhode Island's Marine Advisory Council, and she received her BS from Yale and her PhD from the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island in biology. Now, I got to first meet Dr. Whitehouse at the Ocean Leadership. Ocean Leadership, I'm not supposed to say this, I guess. Well, it's okay to say it's an advocacy group for marine sciences and oceanography in Washington, D.C. I can't say it's a lobbying group. It's an advocacy group. We met there, and then this last fall, I got an email from Sandra saying, we need your help with regard to trying to help preserve the National Ocean Policy Act that was under fire in the Congress, and I think you're going to hear a little bit more about that. So the two of us drafted a letter for our Dean, Minghua, to send to Tim Bishop, our local representative, who also is very influential in Washington and the House dealing with ocean policy. So we did that, and at that time then I said, why don't you come down and give a talk? So there probably is nobody in Washington that's had more influence on the government in dealing with national ocean policy than Sandra. The other thing that I think I should mention is that she's going to talk mainly about National Ocean Policy Act and marine and coastal or marine spatial planning. This is particularly important for us. It's called an executive order, but there's probably has not been a piece of, if you loosely call it legislation, it's been more influential than that has in the last 2 decades. So Sandra, welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thanks. So I realize some of you have to be here. But first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the introduction. I am a fallen marine scientist. I went from pure research to policy to working with politicians. So I guess it's a downward spiral. But also I'd like to just say how encouraging it is for me to look out at a room and see a lot of women in the marine sciences. When I was in the marine, when I started my PhD, there were very few. There were a lot of men with beards. No offense to the men with beards here. But I really am encouraged to see so many women pursuing this as a career. So I am going to talk a little bit about, I really want to focus on the National Ocean Policy, and the coastal marine spatial planning is a part of that. But I also want to start with a little bit of sort of the history about how we got to the National Ocean Policy. So really what we're all working on in policy in a very sort of summary way is trying to find a sweet spot for how we use our ocean among our needs as a society, to use the ocean sometimes for cultural or religious purposes, for our quality of life. Certainly a lot of our economy is based on the maritime sector, and then of course doing these things while keeping our ecological resources healthy. So this is just my sort of summary of like ocean use worldwide. In Belgium in 2005, the first real, what I would look at as a marine spatial plan was started. There had been some earlier work in Australia, but it was very much geared to just one issue, which was conservation. And what they started doing was mapping out all of their uses And they were really the first people that started showing that this was a pretty big, the sea was a busy area. They actually also tabulated how much of all those uses, how much space everybody said they needed, which was 264%, since we actually only have 100%. That was just an easy way for them to start saying, this is actually based on their existing legislation at the time. So this was getting, the beginning of why do we need to look at managing our ocean spaces. At a similar time, well, a little bit later on, Turnipseed published a good article in Science, which I recommend to you. It's very short, where she just looked at the management regimes just off of the New England coast, and also just was able to describe how complicated things are with many agencies with overlapping management responsibilities. So the problem was really, starting to coalesce around that our current approach was single species or sector. We were just managing for fisheries, or just managing for wind, or dredge material disposal, which I know Larry has worked on in the past. We had a system, mostly under NEPA, that was really entirely reactive to permit applications. We want to put an LNG terminal here, we want to put a new shipping lane there. And the authorities were really fractured, as we saw in the previous slide. There's actually over 140 laws. They're managed by 20 different agencies. As an applicant for a permit, you could have the EPA tell you something very different than what the Army Corps of Engineers might tell you in terms of how you had to operate, where you needed to go, what you needed to do. So it was very complicated. So I just want to give you, before I get into just one example of why we need this kind of proactive planning. This was a project. This is, you'll see I'm a Rhode Islander, so I'm very Rhode Island centric. A lot of my examples are from Rhode Island. This was a project that was proposed in 2008 off the shores of Rhode Island in this area by a company called Grays Harbor that wanted to hang some they wanted to build a hydrokinetic facility basically offshore in this area that's got a pretty high current regime. And these were actually going to go further down, up throughout the water column. They found out after 6 months of permitting and spending $1 million that that's same areas where the submarine lanes come in and out of New London. So clearly not a great place to be hanging hydrokinetic turbines in the water. But different organizations and agencies were managing those two aspects. So, it took them a while to actually sort of understand that it was a problem. So that's just one example of these problems that were arising with conflicts among uses. So when President Obama was elected in 2008, the NGO community was really looking at this as an opportunity to make some progress with ocean management and be able to prioritize ocean health. Ocean Conservancy, we convened our NGO working group, the alphabet soup of national organizations. It was very much like herding cats. But what we did come up with, we started working really in the beginning of 2009, and we asked the president to create a task force to look at ocean management and how we balance health and use. So he created the Ocean Policy Task Force with memo. It was led by Nancy Sutley, who's actually, I'm going to her retirement party next Tuesday. She's now leaving. And what it said was in 90 days, you have to develop a recommendation for a national ocean policy. And within 180 days, you need to develop a framework for coastal and marine spatial planning. And in fact, amazingly, they met their deadlines. And in fact, in September of 2009, they had an interim report for the National Ocean Policy. And by December, they had an interim report for coastal marine spatial planning framework. And this was, after a lot of public meetings, meeting with individual stakeholders. They held meetings all over the country to get input on both the policy and the planning framework. So by the beginning of 2010, we were pretty much thinking that the National Ocean Policy was going to be issued at any minute. And then there was, delay, and then in April, the Deepwater Horizon spill happened. And everyone in the administration and all of the NGOs obviously turned their attention towards this issue. And it was interesting that one of the things that people started asking was, well, if we had coastal marine spatial planning, would we have had the Deepwater Horizon spill? And obviously the answer is yes. The plan wouldn't have prevented the spill that was due to human error. But when you start looking at how we reacted to the spill, it started building the case even more for why you need good management. This is obviously where, I'm sure you've seen something similar to this, where the spill actually took place. We started looking and compiling a lot of information and mapping it. This is where the wildlife at risk obviously was everywhere. But we also started looking at how the governmental agencies were responding to the spill. And one of the proposals by the state of Louisiana, by the governor and the Army Corps of Engineers, the Corps likes to build things, was to build this big sand berm. It was going to cost $350 million, 100 miles long, that was going to protect these fragile wetlands that are obviously throughout this area in Louisiana. So in June, they started building these sand berms. This is a picture from June 25th. However, they haven't really looked comprehensively over the system to think about what is the sediment transport in this area, what's erosion. And 10 days later, that's the same sand berm. So clearly now we've got a marine debris problem. This is the slide that the governor's office released. Stuff being built, protecting the wetlands. They did not ever release these images. But to me, that was just an example of, why having a proactive plan where you can anticipate that things like this might happen. How are you going to respond to it? So it's not, this was a bit of a political response because the governor needed to do something that was visible and big, but it didn't work. So that was another case to me about why you need this kind of proactive management. So finally, in July, after the dust had settled a little bit on the Deepwater Horizon spill, we got our executive order, and in July 19th, 2010. So Larry asked me to just sort of describe, an executive order is basically something that the president puts out to direct his agencies how to operate and how to prioritize their work. It is not a piece of legislation. And so there's some executive orders that have actually had great impact and been durable. For example, NOAA was created by an executive order. It's never had what they call an organic act. And yet there's other executive orders that have just ended up being paper on a shelf. So I'm going to go a little bit through sort of what the National Ocean Policy is now. I do want to mention, though, that the executive order with respect to the National Ocean Policy was almost identical to what had been put out under President Bush in the U.S. Ocean Commission report in 2004. And a lot of the similarities were the goals: protect and maintain and restore ecosystem health, support sustainable uses. Wind wasn't as much of an issue in 2004, but it had similar language about the economy, and preserve our maritime heritage. It also was similar to the U.S. Ocean Commission in prioritizing ecosystem-based management. And I'm assuming many of you know the term, and we try not to use it anymore because it's so policy wonky. We try to say taking a holistic approach. But basically the idea is that you're going to collect information about all the important pieces of the system, from the biological components to the physical components, and also consider what the human uses are and try to manage holistically for all of these, as opposed to the sort of sector by sector that has been done in the past. If you're going to manage holistically, you have to have coordination among the agencies. So the executive order created the National Ocean Council with the 20 relevant agencies. I couldn't find all their logos. But basically it says, okay, you agencies have to work together, and here's the structure you're going to have to do so. It also defined 9 planning regions, which are roughly based on the large marine ecosystems, taking into account governance. It's hard to split a state in half, for example, and said each region of these had to go out and develop a plan. But the part of the executive order that Obama put out that was new was the framework for coastal marine spatial planning. And it's really, a lot of this is about, this is just a tool. And what I like to sort of emphasize is coastal marine spatial planning is a tool that we have in part because our GIS capability had improved so dramatically between 2004 and 2010 in order to manage on an ecosystem basis to achieve the goals of health and use. So we're not out there just trying to do marine spatial planning for its own sake. It's toward a purpose. And this is my Marine Spatial Planning 101 slide. If you want to remember just one thing, please remember this slide. Because what I'm trying to depict here is that you go out, you collect information not only on ecological resources, but also existing uses like shipping and recreation, and you start overlaying these maps. And then you can start teasing out areas where there might be so many ecologically important species that you want to conserve that area, but hopefully also find some areas where it would be appropriate to cite emerging or new uses like wind farms or offshore agriculture. The idea around this kind of planning is it's planning to reduce conflicts, whether they're conflicts between uses, such as obviously shipping and wind farms don't go very well together, or between various uses and the environment. It's also, hopefully, a planning tool that we can use to evaluate cumulative impacts. Because obviously the ecosystem is experiencing more than just nutrient input or trawling, overfishing, or something from oil and gas. It's often more than the sum of the parts. And it's also a planning that we hope will be adaptive. The idea in the executive order said that every 5 years a plan had to be evaluated for how it was doing and changed in any way that was necessary. And I mean, even now we're seeing on the West Coast, there's new technology being developed for having floating wind turbine platforms because they're it's very deep there. And obviously we have dramatically changing conditions with climate. So, I mean, I showed the result of Sandy, but my point here is that if you're going to create a marine protected area for some particular species today, you have to understand that that species may not even be in that location as water temperatures increase. So you have to think into the future. And it's very important that the process of planning includes stakeholders, not only from the NGO community, but from the user groups as well, so they can start really sort of looking at where they want things to go. So I'm going to go through now just an example of marine spatial planning. I'm starting off with, in Rhode Island, people were literally sitting around a table with maps, trying to decide where they wanted things to go or not go. This plan actually started in 2008, so it was actually gearing up as the Ocean Policy Task Force was doing its work. So the goals as set out in the Special Area Management Plan were they needed to find a place for wind development, and they wanted to have conservation of the system. Because there's so much of our economy, not only for its own sake, but also a lot of our economy is whale watching and recreational fishing and tourism, so conservation is very important. So now I'm going to just start showing you some of these maps. These are like the maps, the data overlays, and if you're going to do a wind farm, you want to know what the wind speed is, you want to know what the bathymetry is, since these are going to be turbines that are going to be pile driven. You need to know what the bottom type is. In Rhode Island, we have a lot of glacial moraine left over from the last ice age. You can't drive a wind piling very easily into, if there's too many rocks. There are a lot of overlays for ecological resources. This is diving duck habitat. And then some of the uses, this is fixed gear fishing, so mostly lobster pots. Mobile gear is trawling, recreational fishing. Even if you start overlaying just the fishing uses, you would say, oh my gosh, there's nowhere to go. So this is where you have to start making trade-offs. There's also a lot of ship traffic going in and out of the area. I'm sorry for the poor quality of the text, but there's dredge material disposal sites. There's underwater cables. We have a big Navy presence in Newport and have for a long time. So there's places like here, unexploded ordnances. Those are actually places where the Navy had tested, the name wrong, basically bombs. And a lot of them are unexploded and are still on the bottom. So again, you don't want to be driving and piling in there. But anyway, it's there's a lot going on. So the SAMP was actually concluded in 2010. 49% of the area was protected for the minimum conservation, which was no industrial development is going to take place in these gray areas. As the SAMP moves forward, there will be additional layers of conservation placed in many of within these gray areas. And since one of their goals was to find a place for a wind farm, they designated this area off Block Island as a renewable energy area. And now, just recently, Deepwater Wind has, in fact, proposed 5 turbines for a pilot project within the renewable energy area. It's important to note, this does not mean that this is pre-permitted. It means that this is the area that the stakeholders have come together, the agencies have come together to say, we think this is the area that's most appropriate for a wind farm based on all your variables. Also recently, someone actually from Deepwater Wind, who's been very supportive of the planning, said to me, well, we either need to plan now or pay later. And one of the issues that has actually just been resolved between the wind company, Deepwater Wind, and the Conservation Law Foundation, whose business it is to sue companies that they don't like what they're doing, is the wind farm is here. We're looking at a different scale now. But what they found in the SAMP when they did the planning was that these yellow areas where there's a lot of whales present in the spring. And so they've already agreed, without having to be subject to litigation, because they had the information, that they're not going to do pile driving in the spring in a 6-week period. So this is how the information has been used to make the conservationists and the whales happy, but also for the company to be able to avoid litigation. However, at the same time, when we were creating this framework and Rhode Island was doing its plan, the Department of Interior was also who was a member of the National Ocean Council, was also rushing forward to fulfill Obama's renewable energy mandate and look for wind energy areas off of the coast. And so the green areas are what they designated as wind energy areas. What they didn't look at was the Coast Guard AIS data, which anyone can get off the internet. My niece, who's 6, could have done it, to see that these are the traffic lanes for ships. I mean, the traffic lanes are going right through what they propose as a wind energy area. And so, they sort of hummed and hawed and said, oh, well, we just proposed that area. We didn't think anyone would think we were going to use all of it. But unfortunately, this was just at the time when marine spatial planning was coming out as a concept, and DOI was also saying, this is marine spatial planning. And we had to say, no, it's not. This is the old way of doing business, with looking for single sector use, which was wind, without actually working in concert with your other agencies. Anyway, now they're much more proactive, and I think they've learned their lesson, and they're a very active and productive member of the National Ocean Council. So also, when the National Ocean Policy was put out, this was the time frame, all 9 regions were going to be done by mid-2015. So clearly, that was ambitious. There was a lot of grumbling about unfunded mandates. You've probably heard that term before. However, some things have started to move forward. And so the Northeast started its planning process in November of 2012. They had actually their meeting to set goals just last week. So things are moving, they're moving a little bit slowly. Some of it's a function of resources, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they are underway. They've put up their data portal, so part of this planning process is bringing all the stakeholders together, bringing the agencies together, creating these maps, putting them up on the web so that they're publicly available. This is how you start the planning process. They've also filled some really critical data gaps. One of the uses that had really no good information was recreational boating. They did a survey during the summer of 2012 and actually had like 30,000 recreational boaters participate for the whole summer to map where they went. They were incentivized by a $500 gift certificate to West Marine, which is very clever. But now we really have, these are just the densities, knowing where this use is taking place in a much more scientifically accurate way. The Mid-Atlantic launched its regional planning body just this past September. They've been working, they've also launched their data portal. If you're interested, go to either the New England or Mid-Atlantic data portals, because they have a lot of information and they're kind of fun. You can go in and say, I want to look at fishing and shipping and gravel as the data overlays that you want to see. But they're very user-friendly. So now I'm going to get to some of the work that I have been doing at Ocean Conservancy and my program. You know, all of this national ocean policy is great. Having this tool is great. But unless you have any money to actually go and do it, it's all for naught. So we have been working to get these things implemented, to get federal resources. And just in a nutshell, I'm going to sort of give you a little bit more detail. For FY11, we started off with $20 million in the president's budget. We got $7 million by the time it came out the other end of Congress, and I'm going to talk about the process. For 12, we got 3.5. For 13, we got 4. For FY14, we might get nothing, which will be a bit of a problem. For FY15, we're back in starting the process at 5. So I wanted to tell you, and then I forgot about these slides. This is just where the money was spent, which regions, and just to note, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region, as you'll see for these 3 years of funding, have gotten a good piece of the money, and part of that is because 13 ended up actually not being 4, it ended up being 3.2 because of the sequestration. But those, in fact, because they were ready, it was politically palatable, the stakeholders wanted the planning, that's why those 2 regions have gotten the money and moved forward. So now I'm going to talk about the appropriations process, which is legislation, as you all have heard. It's like making sausage, you don't really want to know what goes into it. But it's a lot of the work we do, and I thought it would be interesting to sort of give you a glimpse of how you get federal money. So we started off in FY13. You start with the president's, his administration. We have Dr. Lubchenko, that was the head of NOAA then. She's very friendly. She came into NOAA with coastal marine spatial planning being one of her 3 top priorities, so she was very supportive. She put it in her budget. Then it goes to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, where they're getting requests from all of the different agencies. We started working with OMB, and as an advocate, we go there and say, look at this great tool that's been developed in the Northeast with this data portal. We would bring a fisherman in with us who could say, isn't this great? This information is really valuable to me. It also gives me confidence that when they're siting a wind farm, my most heavily fished areas aren't going to be designated. So we start with stakeholders very early on. By the end of 2013, we got $4 million from our friendly president. And then we go to Congress. with the president's budget when things get a little bit more difficult. So we start off by identifying what are our priority states, and this is sort of a combination of where is there traction for this kind of work and drivers. So things are happening we can point to out in the water, wind farms are being proposed, aquaculture facilities. We also have to look at who are the members who are sitting on the various committees, the most key committees being the Appropriations committees. So one of the people we had for our FY 2013, and I'm sure most of you know that FY 2013, that work's actually being done in 2012 for the 13 budget. So this is Norm Dix from Washington, who has sadly since retired, but he was a huge champion for us in terms of advancing this work through the legislative process. We get a lot of people, especially people who represent ocean jobs, to come in and sign letters that go state by state to our key members of Congress saying, we want you to put $10 million for this work into NOAA's budget. And then these letters go to the appropriations chairs. We also get individuals to write letters, so people like Mike Keyworth from the Land Trade Association would write letters. And this is the kind of individual letter, which I'll get to word of, that your dean helped on a different piece of legislation. And then we do a stakeholder fly-in, which is a little bit crazy, but this was actually one of our easier. In 13, we had 8 stakeholders. For FY 14, we had 23 stakeholders. So we were managing 23 people to come in from all around the country, from our key states and districts. We set up meetings for them on the Hill, and we prepped them to go in and say, this work matters to us, we need you to support the money. Throughout all of this, there's been an underlying drumbeat of opposition. And not just for the appropriations process, but for the policy for itself. Primarily the opposition has come from the oil and gas community because they don't want to have anything that's going to impede where they might want to drill or do seismic testing. And some of it's come from the recreational fishing sector. Part of that, I think, is a bit of a backlash from some work that was done in California called the Marine Life Protected Act, which had a specific goal of creating marine protected areas, but the recreational fishing community was sort of taught that the NGO community wanted to take their space away from them. As the marine protected areas have actually been implemented, in fact, they've been a boon to recreational fishing because there's more fish. But it's a little bit matter of sort of being territorial. Anyway, one of our prime opponents is Doc Hastings, who's been holding hearings, which literally have had, these are the actual titles from the hearings: National Ocean Policy, Further Restrictions, Alaska's Sovereignty in Peril, Empty Hooks, the latest threat to fishers. So he's holding hearings and getting people who are against this to come in and say this is a bad thing. We've also had Representative Flores from Texas, from an inland district, but who is largely funded by oil and gas PACs. And he has been diligent in terms of putting legislation against national ocean policy into any bill that he can insert it into. So appropriations bills, the Hurricane Sandy relief, WRDA, which was one of the things that was in the dean's letter to counter. So, you know, all of this is happening. So a lot of our work is not only advancing, saying this is a good thing, but also having to counter these people who are in opposition. But really, if we want to get money to do this right, it's not going to be $3 to $7 million a year. I mean, that is a droplet in the federal budget. We really need hundreds of millions of dollars. And, you know, when we go back to the U.S. Ocean Commission, the idea was to have set up something called an Ocean Trust Fund. And wonderful Representative Farr from California, for 4 years in a row, submitted legislation which was called Oceans 21, which would have created an Ocean Trust Fund from oil and gas revenues from their lease fees. So it went in, it was submitted every year, but it never made it even into committee. Sadly, it didn't go anywhere. But we thought there was a new opportunity with a new national ocean policy in 2010, and in 2010 there was both a House and Senate were under Democratic leadership, so that's important to note. And we, in fact, in 2010 got through the House a bill called the CLEAR Act, which in fact created this funding stream for hundreds of millions of dollars a year from OCS revenue. So that was a great win. Unfortunately, we didn't get through the Senate in 2010. In 2012, so this is a different Congress, we got it through the Senate, but the House had gone Republican, so we couldn't get it through the House, despite our best efforts. So sadly, there was never a connect between these two bills, and my government relations folks like to say, well, we got it through both the House and the Senate. And I'm like, well, it was in different Congresses. It's kind of like getting to the altar on a different day from your betrothed. You're not going to get married. It's not going to happen. But now, in 2013, we have another opportunity. We got the National Endowment for the Oceans, again through the Senate. And we have it, this is broader than just marine spatial planning. This is just the language of, excuse me, how the money can be used, but it's a lot of funding, a lot of the kind of work that Stony Brook's working on, modeling, planning, research. It also specifically calls out these issues as important ones to put funding toward. So this got into the Water Resources Development Act, which is the authorizing bill for the Army Corps of Engineers. So without having this bill passed, the Army Corps of Engineers is going to have to stop doing their work. And there's even a lot of Republicans who rely on the Army Corps of Engineers' work to get done. They're doing flood control and building levees. To show you the level of support for, it's called WRDA, in the House, I think there were only 4 no's on the WRDA bill, and in the Senate, I think there were 2. Everybody wants this bill to pass. It went into conference, which is where the House and the Senate try to bring the 2 pieces of the legislation together and agree to what the final is going to be in November, which is when we got help from Stony Brook. Much to our amazement, no one knows what's happening. It's stalled. It's difficult because it has both the National Endowment for the Oceans from the Senate side of the bill, but in the House side of the bill, we have another one of our arch enemy #1, Flores' amendments, saying none of the money in this bill shall be used towards national ocean policy. So really what we need to do is make sure that the National Endowment for the Ocean stays in and the Flores rider gets pulled. Anyway, I just, in conclusion, do really believe that it's our responsibility to ensure that our ecosystem's healthy, that we understand it well enough to manage it properly, because we have a lot of our oceans are being heavily used, and there's more and more pressure to continue to use them. So that's all I have, and thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
So from what it sounds like, research is pretty easy compared to creating ocean policy that is actually enacted. So let's turn up the lights and take some questions.
Sir.
Could you explain why, when you showed the map of priority states, I was expecting to see Florida there, but it didn't have a star. What happened?
Well, although there's a lot of things in Florida that would very much benefit from marine spatial planning, including sea level rise, it's also a function of the members of Congress from Florida, which committees they sit on. So that was for the appropriations, which is getting the money to the regional ocean partnerships. So the House and Senate members from Florida don't sit on appropriations committees. It's not that it's not a priority state in terms of the need to plan. It's not a priority state in terms of what committees those members sit on.
When you say that, then if you do get the funding, does that mean that a state like Florida or a state that's not a priority wouldn't get as much funding?
No, once the funding is acquired, it goes to NOAA and they run a competitive grants process. So the funding actually it could go to states. It's designed actually for the regions, the regional planning entities. So the New England region is called NROC, the Mid-Atlantic is MARCO, Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Council. The Florida is actually an interesting state because they have two regional planning entities that cover them. There's the South Atlantic Regional Alliance, I think. They all have different names. Why they couldn't be consistent, I don't know. The South Atlantic Regional Alliance covers the north coast of Florida, and the Gulf Coast Alliance covers the west coast. So, but Florida's going to have to work with on both regions.
Yep.
A related question, you did have a star next to Mississippi. I assume that might be Thad Cochran? Or?
Yes. He has been interested in this. He hasn't necessarily been a champion. But finding, it's very important for us to find some moderate Republicans who care about the marine environment to help with this. And in fact, especially now, it's even more important than it was in 2012.
And I think he even has a primary challenge this year. So.
Yeah, from the right.
Yeah.
Question back here.
You alluded to how difficult it was to get marine protected areas into the MLPA, and I saw earlier in your presentation that Rhode Island actually got 49% in their stamp. I'm really interested in the background of that and how difficult it was to get that much area deemed no development. And I understand Rhode Island is heavily tourism, but was that it or?
Well, first of all, the Marine Life Protected Act in California was just the state of California. So, and the mandate was create marine protected areas. So, that was what they had to do. But they're discrete. And I don't know exactly the designation, but protection is a spectrum. From the most rigid protection, which is only researchers can go there, no one can fish, it's no take. And there are places in California that have achieved that highest level of conservation. In Rhode Island, we have a very strong conservation ethic. I mean, our entire culture, we are the ocean state. Our entire culture is geared toward our ocean space. And so there was a lot of political receptivity to having conservation be a real priority. But that 49%, it is one of the lowest levels of protection because it only says you can't put a major industrial development there, which is a wind farm, a hydrokinetic turbines, a big offshore aquaculture, a new LNG facility. They are already working, though, on looking within that area. For example, a lot of those glacial marine areas, which are big rocky cobble areas, are really important habitat for not only habitat in general, but especially for some of the commercially important species like lobsters. So they're looking at putting additional conservation measures on those areas. It's very hard to achieve the highest level of conservation, which is no take for fishing, because the commercial fishing folks are often against that. In Rhode Island, we have a really well-educated commercial fishing group of commercial fishers, and they really understand that to have an area which is no take benefits their business in the long run. So a lot of it is the culture and the political palatability for conservation. Let me just add one thing to that, which is the way this was designed of having the 9 regions was not only if you're going to plan on an ecosystem basis, you obviously have to look at the large marine ecosystem, and it would be crazy for Rhode Island and Connecticut or to have totally separate plans. I mean, our system is so much one. On the West Coast, that region actually might end up getting divided in half, with Washington and Oregon being one and California being another because they're so vast. But it's also very much in recognition that each region is culturally different. In New England, if oil and gas was going to be proposed, every member of the congressional delegation would go ballistic. In the Gulf, it's part of their culture. We have to recognize that continued oil and gas development there is going to occur, but a plan in the Gulf hopefully will site new facilities to minimize damage, and also recognize some of the other uses.
Any other questions? Yes.
So I know sometimes in conservation policy, they'll invite like an economist in to try and quantify what the ecological value is of the human value. So I'm wondering if you've seen that approach at all when they're actually allowed to spatial plan holistically, and if it works, or if it's just like who has the most money.
Well, good question. I mean, that's really the whole science of ecosystem services, and that is still in its infancy. There is definitely interest ultimately in including ecosystem service values in planning. I just think we're not there yet. What they have started to do, though, is a step toward that, which isn't necessarily quantifying the service, but for example, in the recreational boating survey that I showed for New England, not only did they quantify where those people are going, they're also quantifying what they're spending. So it's buying your sandwiches, buying your gas for your boat, getting a new, something for that you're going to recreate with. And that actually amounted to $3.5 billion a summer for New England. That's big money. And so even though it's not necessarily an ecosystem, it could be interpreted as ecosystem service, not in the sense of an ecosystem service being the fish that you're catching. But it's, people aren't going to go recreational fishing if there's nothing to catch. And so it's a back-end way to get at quantifying something that is reliant on a healthy ecosystem. So when you're doing things like siting a wind farm or an LNG facility, you can have a dollar value to counter when someone's going to come in and say, well, this new LNG facility is going to create 400 jobs. It gives you more economic information, but we're definitely not yet, unfortunately, at the point of being able to quantify the value, at least within this process, for a seagull or a quahog.
Other questions? I have one for you.
Okay.
Most of the people here are being trained to be some sort of an ocean scientist, as you were. How do you get into the business of being an ocean advocate and trying to develop policy? What tools do you need besides just being a scientist?
Interest. I think it's interest. I mean, I would hope, quite frankly, that anyone who's in marine science steps up to the plate as an advocate at some level. And whether that's, writing an op-ed to your local paper about what some of the work you're doing and the value of it ecologically, or calling up Representative Bishop to say we want money for regional ocean partnerships. That's probably a stretch. But I think, I'll tell you, I mean, the reason that I got into policy was somewhat out of a frustration that I saw laws being written in Rhode Island and policy being developed with a total dearth of information about what they were legislating. No one understood what was actually happening in Narragansett Bay. And I think it's partly our responsibility as scientists to weigh in on policy and make sure that the information that you're collecting is useful for managers and that you're putting it forward to managers. I mean, part of the beauty of doing this kind of comprehensive planning is that the foundation is the data. And it's not just the data on where there are seagrass bed, it's also the information on a paper that might describe how seagrass is being damaged by shading or something, or turbidity. So it's not just the spatial aspect, it's also understanding the system. And that's what you all need to produce, but hopefully you'll also make sure that the research that you're doing and the science can get put into the management and policy arena. But I also think, at Ocean Conservancy, there are a number of people who are in policy who have degrees in marine science, and it's really what your passion is.
So one of the things that you're doing, I think that none of us really appreciate very much, is that the end result is that you're creating resources that eventually may end up here.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So having people like you is extremely important. Jim?
On that note, how do you deal with the slow process and the frustration? This whole process would not necessarily survive this administration. So how do you deal with that?
Patience, tenacity. Look at someone like Representative Farr from California. He started putting in his legislation in 2004, and it's still not through yet. You don't give up. What is the Churchill on the carry on and don't give up? You just keep trying. And the other thing is, because the funding is so important, we look for any opportunity that we can we're working with the Department of Interior to try to get some of the Sandy relief funding to go towards the management. We're always looking for money. But there is definitely a concern that because this was created by executive order, that it could conclude at the end of this administration. And part of what we're trying to do now is ensure that these regions can move forward, and that by the end of the administration, they're far enough along that other regions are going to say, okay, well, I actually see the benefit of that and want to do it. Without getting into sort of the complications of it, we're also launching an effort to create an interstate compact, at least for New England, that will give more legal durability to their planning process. Sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out what may be so obvious that got overlooked with Larry's question about what's necessary for people to influence policy. The third leg of the stool is communication skills.
Yes.
You have to have the knowledge, you have to have the passion, but you also need to be able to communicate to a non-technical audience to deal with the soundbite. And my personal recommendation is get out there, communicate, give talks whenever you can. Read Dale Carnegie. It's amazing. I have 50-year-old Dale Carnegie books that are enormous value in being able to express yourself to people who probably are not experts in what you're an expert in, but you have to convey that information in a way that doesn't turn them off.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up. I actually was one of the co-founders of an organization called the Metcalf Institute in Rhode Island, which is actually to train scientists to be able to speak to journalists, as well as journalists to know how to ask questions of scientists. And a lot of the way we're communicating this, to be honest with you, we started off talking about ecosystem-based management and coastal marine spatial planning. We don't even say that anymore. We talk about looking at the big picture, managing holistically. We don't talk about stakeholder engagement using Marcom tools. We talk about having ocean town hall meetings. Making things understandable to an average person, because even in the policy field, we have a tendency to talk in our little policy wonky jargon and not make it understandable to not only the media, but also the public. So thank you for bringing that up.
Just to sort of carry that on, Just recently, when I was talking to one of the newspapers, they told me not to use the word glaciation because most of the people that read newspapers would not understand it. So, you know, we talk about keeping your message simple, and it really has to be kept simple, I think. All right, so
Thank you.
thank you very much. This is going to be delivered, I think, in a little while. It's here? So we're going to go down the hall. Want to freshen up? Okay.